Welcome to the Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark Gods Rise, Chapter 47, Preparations for Beyond. In his prison, Walshira felt his power return as he drained the life from a 10th mage. Again he lashed out with a tentacle of cloud to catch and savor the fear and loathing his presence created. Panic added more flavor, as did hatred, grief, sadness, and hope betrayed. This was a banquet indeed. Sated at last, the Old One looked toward his high priest. "Would you like to live forever?" he asked. King Andreas Faravan flinched at the touch of his god's voice, for while it caressed him in tones of velvet and honey, it also promised pain and 1,000 torments. He shuddered at the offer. "My lord," he replied, "I could not bring myself to become like my soldiers." Memory of what the guard captain and his men had become had him swallowing bile, and he tried for conciliatory tones. "As great as your gift is, I do not wish to live forever as a half-crazed, flesh-eating monster, or something hated by all who cling to life." He ducked his head in submission. "Nevertheless, if that is what you desire for me." The god gave him the impression of shaking its head. "You mistake my offer," he said. "I would not have my most favored servant become as those. I'm offering you life eternal, but able to produce children as other men do, never decaying, able to bless and curse as you wish, and to charm the minds of mortals to your will." "My lord," Andreas breathed, his desire evident in those two words. But Walshira wasn't finished. "I will give you the ability to wield the power imparted by the blood of mortals as much as I do myself. You will be my vessel in freedom, keeping my name before men until I return." His last words struck like a mortal blow, and the king dropped to his knees. "My lord," he cried, "you're not leaving me?" Walshira hurried to soothe him, wrapping him in the billowing pall of his presence. "No, my child, but there are those who will try to entrap me, and they may be able to block my power for a time. I would not have you powerless when you face them." Andreas felt the mist firm, the god's touch on his head like a hand stroking his head in comfort. Beyond the gentleness of that touch, he could feel the god's power and the god's hunger for more power, and an answering desire stirred in his heart. "Come, if you are still afraid," the god coaxed. "Come, and I will show you the form you will take. Then you will be able to decide if you want that power to be yours." The mist parted, and the king found himself staring into the blood-filled trench at the altar's foot. What he saw was a being filled with the very power he desired for himself, and one not reliant on a deity to provide it. The idea enthralled him, as ignorant as he was of the way such creatures had been hunted the world over. That was a fact Walshira was careful to keep from him. His most essential servant didn't need to know how the elemental gods of the pantheon before had scoured the world to find and destroy these, the most powerful of his servants. It gave him a great deal of satisfaction to know that even the gods that had been before had failed to find them all. His creations had hidden, and when Walshira had finally been imprisoned and his link to them had been lost, they'd gained free will, and each had continued with its own desires. The elemental lords hadn't been aware of this last fact, and neither had Walshira. As far as he knew, his creations had died when his link to them had been severed. That is what he expected to happen. As far as he knew, he was offering the king a unique existence. He observed his servant, who was watching wide-eyed as the lives of Walshira's abominations unfolded before him. Fear turned to enchantment at the idea, and that turned to desire. And that turned to desire. He would, he decided, accept the power the Old One offered. As the last image faded from the pool, Walshira turned to the king. "Well?" King Faravan stayed on his knees and bowed his head. "I would be deeply honored, my lord." If Walshira had been in human form, a smile would have creased his face, and the king would have seen the glitter of calculation that lit his eyes. He hid his elation from his king, taking care to exude benevolence as the king lifted his head. "What now, my lord?" the king asked. Walshira directed his attention to the altar, his eyes locking with those of the occupant chained there. Remove him to the chamber of keeping, he ordered, adding in a soft tone, I'll take my pleasure with him later. The wizard on the altar strained against the chains, moaning as Walshira's soft laughter caressed him. He shuddered as though he'd been touched by the deity, then struggled anew as the king gestured at the waiting undead. No, he moaned as the undead shambled forward to obey the king's signal. The king gestured again, stilling the wizard's struggles and stealing the words of the desperate spell as stasis gripped him. Walshira watched as the wizard was carried away. When the doors behind the altar had closed behind him, he looked once more toward his high priest. Take his place, the god instructed, soothing the sudden fear on his servant's face. The transformation is not painless, but I will accept your pain as a pertinent sacrifice of thanksgiving. The king swallowed, trying to moisten a fear-dried throat before licking his fear-dried lips. Walshira growled impatiently as he sought to answer. Do you wish the power I am offering, or would you prefer to be overrun when my enemies think to contain me in a prison of their own devising? He paused, and the king swallowed again, and again no words came. The hour approaches when I will need you at my side, cloaked and assured in your power. My lord, forgive me, the king replied, bowing over his knees. Then, lest the deity change his mind, forgive my doubts. He added no more, but rose swiftly, and before he could change his mind, mounted the altar and stretched along it. The satisfaction coming from his master was not reassuring, and doubt niggled around the edges of his heart. Be still, Walshira instructed. I will not harm you. Using a silent cast of will, the god summoned the creature he had newly placed in the blood-filled trench at the altar's base. Like the creatures of earth and stone and air, this one rose, serpentine, hissing in annoyance as the king writhed instinctively away from it. It lashed out as its master's servant half rose to a sitting position, wrapping the man in scarlet coils and pinning him to the altar, keeping him still and firmly in place as Walshira began to chant. The king flexed against the creature's coils, then forced himself to relax. He wasn't being harmed, as terrifying as this new weird was, and while Walshira's chant settled over him, that did not hurt either. Taking a deep breath and pondering on the form his new power would take, the king closed his eyes. The chant rolled over and through him, embracing him far closer than the creature entwined around him. It swathed him, then sank through skin and into bone, entering every fibre of his being and warping the threads from which he was woven. Just as he noticed the change, the pain struck, and the king screamed. He had never felt such soul-rending agony. Inflicted it, perhaps, but never felt it. Not until now. Walshira's voice reached him, a distant and very cold comfort. Fear not, the god soothed. Your agony is a worthy sacrifice, as is your despair and confusion. You will become a power to be reckoned with, your new incarnation impervious to most who will come against you. That is what your pain has earned you. The god's words reached him through a fog of agony. There was fire, it was eating him alive. There were daggers, each blade jagged and cruel as it ripped through him. There were carrion birds. They descended and tore at his eyes, his entrails, his very soul. Walshira had betrayed him, and he screamed in despair. The deity's laughter was his only reply, salted velvet in the open wounds of his servant's pain. Be still, my king, he said, his amusement at odds with his soothing words as he lied again. There is not much further to go. The transformation took an eternity, melding all sense of time into a never-ending scream. All the king could think was that nothing could be worth this, that the god could not possibly offer an existence powerful enough to compensate for the destruction raging through him. If the offer were to be made a second time, he would refuse it. All he wanted was to never feel this way again. When the blood weird released him, he wanted nothing more than to scramble from the altar and flee the deity, to never see or serve him again. He could not move, could still feel the blood weird coating his skin, even as he heard it return to its trench and subside in a viscous gurgle. Through the air, whoops, through the roar of remembered agony, he heard his deity approach, and his breath quickened. When he sensed the god halt by the altar and felt the old one studying him, the king reluctantly opened his eyes. The god towered over him, and he shrank from him in fear, wishing he could sink into the stone under his back so he could avoid the deity's gaze. The king watched as the god melded into human form, an outsized man in an armored tunic. He gasped as the god touched him with one giant hand, then felt strength returning, being poured into him, felt his faith return as the pain receded, felt relief as the deity eased his hurts and cleared his mind. You will serve me well, Walshira said, drawing a whoops. His faith returned, accompanied by a leap of joy as Walshira lifted him from the altar top. Not even the god's next words could shake his belief that the pain had been worth it, that his deity had not betrayed him, that you will serve me well, Walshira said, drawing a robe over the king's head and making him wonder when his armor had been removed. Walshira continued as though he didn't know his servant's thoughts wandered. He tweaked the robe, helping Andreas feed his arms into the sleeves and straightening the fall of cloth around him. This is your robe of office, he told the man. Wear it with pride. It is your protection against harm, your cloak against the sun, and a sign of my pleasure. He paused, stepping back to consider his newest creation. And I am well pleased. He took the king's hand, drawing him toward the pillars where a few mages still hung, terrified fruit on ungiving trees, helpless as the old one continued. Now I will teach you how to feed and sustain your power when I cannot answer. The deity's words brought sudden recognition of the hunger gnawing at his insides, and Andreas followed. He not only learned how to feed and gain power from the blood of mortals, but that mage blood was sweet. How much sweeter than the mundane was something he learned when an earth weird returned with a servant from the palace above. It took 2 mages to wash the taste away. When he was sated and the lesson was done, the cries of fear and denial had faded to no more than whimpers of pain and the echoes of a snuffed existence. And Walshira surveyed the hall. That was more expensive than I thought, the deity said, and Andreas decided not to say just how hungry he had been. Walshira continued as though ignorant of the thought. Bring me more, my king. Strip the temples of every god you can find. From now on, there will be one God, and one God only, worshipped in Devarath and Toromar beyond, and I am He. He paused, thinking on the instructions needed and knowing time was short. Serve me in this. Send the soldiers forth. Have them sack the temples and scatter the followers. Harvest the priests and bring them to me in sheaves. Gather the wielders of arcane power and all that endure their tutelage. There will be only one source of magic in this land. The king growled in agreement, his eyes lighting with zealous fire as he summoned his guards, and dimming with concern as he heard the deity's next words. Perhaps I'll be able to delay the deities that plague me. Perhaps you will bring me one who contains enough magic to enable my freedom tonight. It was a faint hope at best, but Walshira wasn't about to admit that. Outside his prison, the enemy gathered. He wasn't mistaken. While he had wrought his destruction in Devarath, the enemy had reached the centre of the garden. Outside the orange-lit chamber there, Raomar stopped. The light swirling around the gem had dimmed. The presence of the creature in the garden and its acknowledgement of their mission had changed a lot of things. Raomar stepped up to the edge of the pit, feeling darkness coalesce in the air around him. A creature of rot and decay rose from the pit's depths to greet him. We withhold our touch at your command, it informed him. The Old One has no place in your world, just as he had no place in the world before it. We have been given charge of guarding him against rescue, but that, I sense, is why you are here. No, Raomar agreed. We're here to secure him once more. The creature dipped its head, its serpentine form showing all forms of decay and detritus, from leaf matter to bone and things that might have been worse. I am the element of decay. It tilted its chin toward the orange tinged air hanging around it. Before you hangs the element of death. We are the final barrier. It inclined its head toward Raomar and those behind him. You need not fear us. You have our permission to cross. Since you are to assist us in our sacred duty, we will not deny you passage. Raomar bowed to the manifest forms of the elements of death and decay. These beings were from a time and a pantheon he did not understand, showing him just how much he had to learn. But first, he had to secure the old one, for all their sakes.